The fluorescent lights in William Abernathy's law office hummed with a low, irritating buzz that seemed to drill directly into Arthur Pendleton's skull. Arthur, 32, drowning in a sea of medical debt from his late mother's illness and facing eviction from his cramped Seattle apartment, stared at the manila folder on the mahogany desk. "I know it's not what you were hoping for, Arthur," Abernathy said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Your grandfather, Henry, wasn't exactly a man of liquid assets, but he left you the entirety of the property in Cypress County. 60 acres of undeveloped land." Martha let out a hollow laugh. 60 acres of scrubland, rocks, and a collapsing farmhouse at the end of Miller Road. I haven't been there since I was 10. Now, Grandpa Henry was a recluse who shot at the mailman twice. What am I supposed to do with it? Pay my rent with dirt? Sell it, Abernathy suggested gently. Land is land. It will fetch something. 2 days later, Arthur found himself standing in front of the rusted wrought-iron gates of his grandfather's property. The farmhouse was a tragic silhouette against the gray Pacific Northwest sky. Its paint had peeled away decades ago, leaving the wood exposed to the elements, rotting and sagging under the weight of time and neglect. The yard was a chaotic jungle of blackberry brambles and overgrown weeds. It was a bleak inheritance, a physical manifestation of his family's generational struggles. Arthur spent the first afternoon hacking his way to the front door and prying it open. The inside smelled of mildew, stale tobacco, and an overwhelming loneliness. He was in the middle of hauling out bags of trash when a sleek silver Mercedes SUV crunched down the gravel driveway, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of rural decay. A man stepped out. He was immaculately dressed in a tailored navy suit and expensive Italian loafers that immediately gathered dust. "Arthur Pendleton?" the man called out, flashing a perfectly white predatory smile. "Thomas Wright, Wright & Sons Development. I heard about Henry's passing. My condolences." Arthur wiped sweat from his brow, leaning against the porch rail. "Word travels fast. What can I do for you, Mr. Kand?" "Right. I'll cut right to the chase," Wright said, taking a step closer. "My company has been eyeing the properties along this ridge for a potential eco-resort. I know you're in a transitional phase. I'm prepared to offer you $800,000 for the deed. Cash. We can close by Friday." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. $800,000. It was a life-altering sum. It meant no more debt, a house of his own, a fresh start. He opened his mouth to say yes, but a sudden strange instinct made him pause. Why was a developer offering nearly $1 million for a parcel of useless, rocky land that couldn't support agriculture and was miles from any major highway? "I'll need a few days to think about it," Arthur said, trying to keep his voice steady. Wright's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of irritation before the veneer returned. "Don't think too long, Arthur. Offers like this don't stay on the table forever." That night, sleeping on a cot in the only room that didn't have a leaky roof, Arthur couldn't shake his suspicion. The next morning he began tearing the house apart, not to clean but to search. He found it in the floorboards beneath Henry's heavy oak bed frame. A metal lockbox rusted shut. Arthur took a crowbar to the latch, snapping it with a sharp crack. Inside wasn't money. It was a collection of topographical maps of the property, covered in red ink, and a thick, leather-bound journal. Arthur spent the next 12 hours reading. Henry hadn't been crazy. He had been obsessed. The journal was a meticulously detailed ledger of geological surveys, water table measurements, and architectural blueprints. But the blueprints weren't for a house. They were for a subterranean vault. The final entry in the journal, dated just 3 weeks before Henry's death, read, "They are getting closer. The ground has shifted near the old willow. If they find out what's in the vault, everything I did in 78 will be for nothing." The past doesn't stay buried. Arthur needed help. He drove into the nearby town of Oak Haven and went to the County Historical Society, hoping to find old property records that might explain what his grandfather was doing. There, he met Rebecca Sterling. Rebecca was sharp, with piercing green eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of Cypress County's history. When Arthur vaguely mentioned his grandfather's interest in local geology, her interest peaked a little too quickly. "Henry Pendleton?" Rebecca asked, leaning over the counter. "He bought that land in 1979, right after the old mining company went bankrupt. He was a very private man. What exactly are you looking for, Arthur?" Deciding he needed an ally, Arthur showed her one of the less incriminating maps. Rebecca's eyes widened. "These are elevation drops." He was mapping an underground cavern system. "The old limestone caves. Rumor had it they ran right under your property." With Rebecca's help, Arthur hired David Jenkins, a local surveyor who owned a ground-penetrating radar, GPR unit. Arthur paid him with the last of his credit card limits. Under the guise of checking for sinkholes, David ran the GPR over the area marked in red near a massive, dead weeping willow. "You've got an anomaly here, Arthur," David said, pointing to the screen. "About 15 feet down. It's not a cave. The angles are too perfect. It looks like a massive box, concrete and steel." Once David left, Arthur and Rebecca began to dig. They rented an excavator, working under the cover of darkness to avoid drawing attention. The work was brutal. For 3 nights they moved earth, fighting through roots and dense clay. On the 4th night, the teeth of the excavator's bucket scraped against something that wasn't rock. It was a dull, echoing screech of metal. Arthur jumped down into the muddy pit with a flashlight and a shovel. He cleared the remaining dirt away to reveal a heavy, reinforced steel hatch, rusted but intact. It had a manual wheel lock. Adrenaline coursing through his veins, Arthur grabbed an iron pipe, wedged it into the wheel, and pulled with all his might. With a sickening groan of resisting metal, the wheel turned. He threw open the hatch. Stale, cold air rushed up from the darkness, smelling of ozone and old paper. "We need to go down," Rebecca said, shining her flashlight into the abyss. There was a metal ladder bolted to the concrete shaft. They climbed down 20 feet into a sprawling, concrete-lined bunker. As Arthur's flashlight beam swept across the room, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a root cellar. Stacked against the walls were dozens of wooden crates. In the center of the room, covered by heavy canvas tarps, were large, bulky shapes. Arthur pulled the tarp off the nearest shape. It was a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. Pristine, untouched. He stumbled backward, pulling the tarp off the next one. A 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR. "What is this?" Arthur whispered. "This is millions of dollars. Tens of millions." Rebecca was busy prying open one of the wooden crates with a crowbar. The wood splintered, and she reached inside, pulling out a brick wrapped in wax paper. She tore the paper back. Stacks of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. But they weren't modern. They were serious 1969 Treasury notes. "The Seattle Federal Reserve heist," Rebecca murmured, her voice entirely devoid of the shock Arthur was feeling. 1978, $30 million in untraceable bills, and a private collection of exotic cars waiting to be shipped overseas, vanished without a trace. Arthur looked at her, his mind reeling. "My grandfather, he was the mastermind?" "No," Rebecca said coldly, dropping the brick of cash back into the crate. "Your grandfather was the getaway driver, and the rat." Arthur froze. The atmosphere in the bunker instantly shifted. The air felt heavier, suffocating. He turned to look at Rebecca, noticing for the first time that she had pulled a small, black semi-automatic pistol from her jacket pocket. It was pointed squarely at his chest. "Rebecca, what are you doing?" "My real name isn't Sterling," she said, her green eyes flashing with a deep generational resentment. "It's Rebecca Miller, as in Miller Road. My grandfather was Jonathan Miller. He planned the heist. He organized the crew. He stole the cars, but Henry got greedy. He took the loot, bought this land under a shell corporation, buried the evidence, and tipped off the FBI anonymously. My grandfather died in federal prison while Henry lived out his days playing the crazy old farmer. You set this up, Arthur realized, the pieces falling into place. I've been looking for this bunker for 10 years, Rebecca sneered. I knew it was on this land, but Henry had it rigged. If anyone dug without knowing the exact coordinates, they'd hit the natural gas line and blow the whole ridge to Kingdom Come. I needed his journal, and I needed his naive grandson to find it for me. And Thomas Wright? Arthur asked, his mind racing for a way out. Thomas is my business partner, she replied. He handles the logistics. We needed to buy the land legitimately so we could excavate the cars without raising eyebrows. You were supposed to just take the $800,000 and walk away, Arthur. You shouldn't have been so damn curious. A heavy thud from above made them both look up. Footsteps echoed down the metal ladder. Thomas Wright descended into the bunker, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit, holding a high-powered flashlight. Brilliant work, Rebecca, Wright said, looking around at the priceless cars. I'll get the transport trucks moving. We can have this cleared out by morning. He looked at Arthur with mild pity. Shame about the Pendleton boy. Tragic accident in an old sinkhole. Arthur backed up against the front grille of the Ferrari. He was unarmed, outmatched, and standing in his own grave. But Henry's journal flashed in his mind. They are getting closer. The ground has shifted. Henry hadn't just been paranoid. He was an engineer. You think my grandfather just buried this and left it unguarded? Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady. He knew Jonathan Miller's family would come looking. You said it yourself, Rebecca. The gas line. Rebecca scoffed. You're bluffing. You don't have a detonator. I don't need one, Arthur said. He reached behind the bumper of the Ferrari. In the journal, Henry had noted a secondary failsafe, a manual release valve tied to the property's old subterranean methane pockets, routed directly into the bunker's ventilation shaft. Arthur's hand found the heavy iron lever hidden in the shadows. He yanked it down hard. Immediately, a loud, violent hissing sound filled the bunker. The smell of rotten eggs and raw gas poured into the confined space. Wright panicked. What did you do? In about 60 seconds, the concentration in here will be dense enough that the static electricity from your clothes will ignite it. Arthur lied, though the threat of the spark was very real. Put the gun down, Rebecca. We all walk up that ladder right now, or we all burn with the cars. Rebecca's hand trembled. She looked at the fortune surrounding her, then at the hissing vent, and finally at Arthur. The sheer panic in Wright's eyes broke her resolve. Let's go. Move! Wright screamed, scrambling toward the ladder and pushing past Rebecca. Rebecca lowered the gun, her face pale, and followed him up. Arthur waited until they were halfway up the shaft before he pushed the lever back up, cutting off the gas flow. He grabbed the heavy iron pipe he'd used to open the hatch and sprinted up the ladder behind them. By the time Arthur reached the surface, Wright and Rebecca were sprinting toward Wright's SUV. Arthur didn't chase them. Instead, he pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He had reception. He dialed 911. This is Arthur Pendleton, he said, breathing heavily. I need Sheriff Brody at the old Pendleton property on Miller Road. I've found something, and tell him to put an APB out for a silver Mercedes SUV driven by Thomas Wright. The aftermath was a media circus. The FBI descended on Cypress County within hours. The Great Seattle Heist had been solved by the grandson of the man who hid it, because the statute of limitations on the robbery had long expired, and because the original owners of the stolen cash had been compensated by insurance companies that no longer existed. The legal battle over the hoard was fierce and unprecedented. Rebecca and Wright were arrested on the highway, charged with attempted murder and extortion. In the end, the federal government seized the cash, but Arthur's lawyer, Abernathy, proved to be much sharper than his dusty office implied. He successfully argued that as the legal owner of the land and the estate, Arthur was entitled to a finder's fee and salvage rights for the vehicles, which had technically been abandoned property for 4 decades. A year later, Arthur Pendleton stood on the porch of a beautifully restored farmhouse on Miller Road. The overgrown brambles had been cleared, replaced by a sprawling garden and a newly paved driveway. He didn't get the $30 million in cash, but the auction of the 1962 Ferrari alone netted him a staggering $48 million at Sotheby's. Arthur looked out over the 60 acres of land. It was no longer a Baron Worth's inheritance. It was his sanctuary. His grandfather, a flawed, paranoid man who lived a life of regret, had ultimately ensured his grandson would never struggle again. Sometimes Arthur thought as he sipped his coffee, the heaviest burdens we inherit aren't burdens at all. They are just treasures waiting for the right person to dig deep enough.